Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Matthew Boedy, author of a new book titled The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. And you'll see this is an early reader copy. That's why there's a red bar at the top. You won't see that in the normal book that's coming out soon. The book is published by Westminster John Knox. Matthew was targeted by Turning Point USA in 2016 and listed on its professor watch list after speaking up against allowing concealed guns on college campuses. As one of the foremost experts on Turning Point USA and its founder and former CEO Charlie Kirk, Matthew exposes their role in perpetuating Christian nationalism in the United States and the threat to democracy they pose. With a background in journalism, an MFA in creative writing, and a PhD in rhetoric, he is a dynamic and experienced scholar whose first book, Speaking of Evil, explored the evolving rhetoric surrounding evil. Matthew currently teaches rhetoric and composition courses at the University of North Georgia, lives in Gainesville, Georgia with his wife and two daughters. You can learn more about the book and Matthew at wjkbooks.com. So Matthew, thanks so much for joining us and congratulations on all of your work.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, I'm sure it's been a busy few days, a couple of weeks for you. But is there anything else that you would like us to know about you and your work?
I would just say, as your audience is watching this, we're filming this a couple of days after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the subject of the book. And I just want to express my deep horror at that event and wish that for really strong faith from his wife and two kids.
Yes, yes, amen. Um, Before we get into the new book, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your previous book, Speaking of
Sure.
Evil. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so that came out of my academic work on the rhetoric of evil. And usually when we think of that phrase, we think about people arguing is something evil or not, or how we should use that label. And I did something a little bit different in that I argued that there is evil in our language, evil in the way that we use words, evil in all the words we use. And that evil is what I described it as overnaming. It comes from another academic, but the idea that when we use words, we are trying to, in many ways, force our definitions upon people. We are freezing them in labels. We are judging them with categories, and we are by the evil that's in our language, we are always already misusing it. And so the line between good and evil runs down between us. I think that's a Bonhoeffer quote. And I talked about Bonhoeffer. So each chapter is certainly a case study in the use of the word evil. So there's a
Mhm.
chapter on World War II. There's a chapter on 9/11, but there's also a chapter on an ancient rhetoric person that used that word. And so it is a description analysis of how they use that word, but then jumping from that is how did they use that word to teach us about our language? So the subtitle, the responsibility of language, how do we meet
Mhm.
that moment with evil in our language? And so that's the book.
Wow, I think I need to check that out. I wasn't aware of it before. So as I mentioned in the intro, you've been on the professor watch list. Could you tell us what the implications of that have been for you?
Well, back in 2016, when Turning Point was trying to become popular, it went viral with this list, which is really just a collection of comments and articles by professors they don't like. It's a warehouse of names and pictures, and they were eager enough to use my wedding picture to link to an article that I wrote in the Atlanta paper arguing against the allowance of guns on campus, of concealed weapons on campus. It is a law now in Georgia that you can do that. And I simply wrote a 850 word op-ed against that, suggesting, of course, that guns on campus, whether seen or unseen, cause a chilling effect in what people end up saying. And so the initial list, I was in, I think I put 100 names on that list initially. And since nobody knew who Turning Point was at the moment, it didn't register individually with me because I worked at a school Free People Heard of. But a lot of my colleagues over the years who have been put on the list for various comments they've made and various things they have written and various things they have taught in their classrooms and on their syllabi have really faced a lot of harassment and a lot of terror from the public who have contacted them. Usually, I've been described as some sort of expert in responding to that because I tell people it's really a hurricane of information and contact and abuse for a couple of days, and sometimes it dies down. But really, it is a target list. It is, we don't like these professors. We think they're indoctrinating us, and they're part of a larger ism at play at higher education. And obviously, Turning Point is a very anti-higher education organization. So I was on the original member of the list, and I've talked about it being on the list, but my colleagues who are perhaps not white and male have faced much more negative reactions than I have.
Hmm. Wow. Crazy times. So let's talk about the book. As I mentioned, the title is The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. So there's a lot of history in this book.
Mhm.
How did the book come about?
Well, I've been writing about Turning Point and Charlie Kirk for several years now. I had a blog going, some fact checks, and wrote some different articles about the things they were doing before they turned to Christian nationalism. Turning Point, in its infancy, was an organization dedicated to lowering the size of government, free market capitalism, and of course that anti-higher education thing. But around 2020, they turned to Christian nationalism for several reasons, and that really just hit right up my alley in terms of an academic. Turning Point was a hobby for me, if you will, but then once they turned into my own academic lane, I recognized right away what it is they were doing. So I started to doing some podcasts and people asking me about the religious rhetoric part of what it is they were trying to do. And Christian nationalism as a phrase became really important in 2016 as Trump won office, and even more in 2020 as it sort of became the rallying cry against his candidacy. So as Turning Point continued on and they raised a lot of money and expanded in all these seven areas, and that's really what the mountains are. They're seven areas of our cultural institutions that they want to take over. So the book really is an outgrowth of all the work that I've done. Somebody contacted me one time and, hey, you want to write a book? And they contacted me with an agent and a publisher. So we did that. And I think what the book is the first look at Turning Point. There are a couple of articles and profiles of Charlie Kirk along the way, but really the wide sweeping plan that they have is what the book is about. So if your audience thinks that Turning Point and Charlie Kirk are merely a college student, conservative student kind of thing, they're missing the bigger picture, and this book is about that bigger picture.
And also kind of the roots of where this came from,
Mhm.
going back a few decades.
Yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about
Sure. I mean,
that?
this Seven Mountains mandate dates back to the 70s. It is a list of these seven, and this list was created by two people who were head of campus ministries in the 70s, and they wanted their college students, their graduates, their alumni of their ministries to influence America for Christ. And I want to emphasize that word influence because early on, the two people, Bill Bright, who founded Cru, and Lauren Cunningham, who founded Youth with a Mission, wanted to just have Christianity influence society. Sometimes they pushed it a little further and became about Christian dominion of taking back America. So around 2000, when a man named Lance Wallnau had a conversation with Lauren Cunningham, he invented the metaphor of the mountains, and where he got it from is kind of lost in history. But the idea is that they're reclaiming the mountains, they're climbing the mountains, they're going to dethrone Satan and these anti-Christian forces around our culture, and they're doing it through these seven specific ways. So yes, the list has been around for 7 years. They didn't invent these institutions. These institutions are in our textbooks and sociological textbooks. But what the plan was, it makes it a very simple strategy. You can work in one area, one mountain, and your friend can work in another area, and with all the army of the Lord, you can take over or take back your nation. And so it really has taken over the conservative evangelical Christian church. It's taken over the Republican Party. I've seen polling that 30 to 40% of Americans would identify with it by its name, Seven Mountains Mandate. And there's a host of groups that are Christian nationalism that don't necessarily use this as their strategy, but would agree with its idea of Christianizing America.
maybe you should share what the seven mountains are so people have a
I
flavor.
always leave one off the list, but I'll try to list them. So there's the mountain of government, the mountain of education, the mountain of family, the mountain of religion, the mountain of media, the mountain of entertainment. Is that seven? I always forget one.
That
I don't.
sounds right.
Yeah, there's seven though.
Uh-huh.
And they each have a different focus on what you could do, in that mountain to take it back for Jesus.
Hmm. So, you know, I think a lot of us would say that they're not trying to take it back for Jesus, right? They're trying to control and assume power for themselves and a right-wing agenda.
Certainly, and they do admit that, but they want to couch it in two myths. One, that America was a Christian nation at its founding, we're merely returning to America that once was. And then two, because they claim that this Christian consensus culture that they want to create is how nations survive. That Charlie Kirk said something along the lines of, we can't have a thriving nation without a moral code or without virtue. And these are the virtues that we want to influence into our culture. He often uses phrases like the good and the true and the beautiful, and we want to do that. So yes, the difference between perhaps early conservative Christians who are involved in politics. They might have been involved in one or two of the mountains. Certainly the mountain of education comes to mind. But Turning Point, in my mind, is the first organization to try to do all seven at once. So that does take an immense amount of influence and power. So the thing about power, though, in this case, the Seven Mountains Mandate is a minority movement. And I want to emphasize that. It is not about mass evangelism. It is not about converting as many people as possible and having a majority of people adhere to a Christian theology. It is about setting up this minority of Christians to run these different cultural institutions. So yes, some of it is about power and some of it is about using anti-democratic power, which is why I'm suggesting, of course, it is a threat to the democracy in which we live in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, any of the books that I interview authors for, I almost always ask them, what do we do about it? Right? It's one thing to
Yeah.
do a great analysis of the issue, and it's another thing to say, okay, what do we do about it?
And I felt that strongly as I was writing the book. In the initial proposal, it was sort of the analysis, and here's the negative picture. And as I was writing the book, I was like, I need something to not leave it as that. So at the end of each chapter, I try to, in a couple of paragraphs, to really lay out what democracy should look like in this particular area, or why we should be invested in religious pluralism, to talk about the mountain of religion. So it is certainly about action in terms of how you might respond. And I mentioned, again, we have to rebuild our nation in terms of who we want to be in community with and how we want to do that. We have to find a way in which to convince the MAGA crowd that we are not the enemy. And so we can do that through cultural institutions, through the very institutions that they want to take over and they want to dominate. We have to find ways to make democracy not just a governmental philosophy, but something that works in all of our different communities. I'm not sure I have individual answers for that, but I've presented at community groups and Sunday schools and trying to get them not just to see this negative picture, but to suggest the ways in which how Christianity and democracy can thrive together.
So, do you have a feeling for which of those seven is most important or most critical that we take back first?
Well, we do see the political battle, the electoral battle is really important. Obviously, electing Donald Trump a second time has been bad for our country. And there are ways in which we should work toward picking right candidates and picking right messages, but I am not a political operative or a political scientist. And so I think that if I were to pick another mountain besides the mountain of government to be important, I do think the mountain of education becomes important. So this is why I'm defending higher education becomes important, supporting public schools, not just with our money, but with our time and with our curriculum that involves all people, not just a segment of them. So the Mountain of Education is their long-term plan. They've been working at that long-term plan for decades now. So for those of us, who have not been doing that, we need a long-term plan in which to respond. It's not going to be a quick fix because they have been working at this, as we said, since the 70s and had success along the way in the different mountains. So the Mountain of Education is a long-term issue or a strategy, and I think that's the most important one.
Interesting. I thought you might say media just because the influence that it has.
No, yes, certainly that is true. If I had to pick one, I picked that one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'd like to read from a couple of the endorsements for your book. This is
Sure.
from our author friend John Pavlovitz, who says, with clarity and precision, Matthew Boedy explains conservative Christians' long game plans to establish theocracy in America. Matthew's words are a calm and steady presence, moving us from overwhelm to agencies. So it was really great to see that John endorsed your book. Would you like to tell us about, how you remain calm in the midst of all of these,
Uh,
terribly troubling issues?
um, well, I was writing the book over last year or so, and then I turned the draft in February. And to be honest with you, I at that point kind of slowly stopped watching news at night. I'm a big fan of CNN. I'm a big fan of journalists. I'm a former journalist, and I want to support that. But at some point, me and my wife just sat down. Hey, you want to watch something else? And just overnight, it became, yeah, let's just watch all seasons of The West Wing, and let's watch this new show over here. So that's certainly one way. And I think that um, now with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, what my response has been is not just as a person who was antagonistic toward him, and I didn't see him as my enemy. I really saw now the danger we're in, and so we can't react with unrighteous anger. We can't act in reactive ways to that because if we do, we are making it worse. And this online arguments that we have are just don't go anywhere. And I'm not sure that again I'm doing a whole lot in my local community to do that. But I guess what I'm getting at is we have to find ways to step back from the rhetoric, but we also have to find ways to purposely build institutions back that are not pitted in the spiritual warfare that the Seven Mountains want to do so.
Yeah. Well, since February, when you said you finished the manuscript, there's a lot that's changed,
Mm.
obviously.
Yeah.
Um, did you have an opportunity or would you want to change anything in your book or add anything to it at this point?
Uh, you know, I think that the chapter organization works well with one mountain per
Mhm. Yeah.
chapter. In some manners, Turning Point and Charlie Kirk are known for putting out a massive amount of content. So at some point, I just have to cut it off and say, I'm only going to pay attention to this. And so I've gotten the question in recent days after his assassination of what is the future of Turning Point. So if I had to say revise or edit, I might suggest, of course, I might want to add more about now what is the future of that group. This is their plan, and they are doubling down on this plan. They're raising money for this plan. But I think that the future of the group itself could do another book. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Um, do you have any sense of what different they're going to do besides just try to get bigger?
I think that with the martyrdom rhetoric that they have now firmly set us in, it is using Charlie's death as the most heightened emotional motivation to not just keep this agenda alive, but to finally see it succeed. And so I describe in the book that Turning Point has brought the Seven Mountains Mandate as closest to success it's ever been. It hasn't been that close because it's always been on the fringes of things, but Turning Point brought it even
Yeah.
further. And now we have just a flood of engagement chapters and Turning Point and money that they could use at their disposal, and they're going to do that because of this. We have to do it because of Charlie. We
Mhm.
have to see that the culture war is won because of that.
So, what's your prognosis for the country overall? I mean, is it going to continue to get worse? When do you think the pendulum is going to swing back in the other direction?
Uh, that's a tough one. Um, I think that it's certainly up to the president and Turning Point. I do believe President Trump wants to seek retribution for this death because it was a personal friend of his, and he will use the federal government to do that. There's, already been talk about investigating organizations and people responsible, and not just the person arrested. And so, Turning Point can I would say help that or assuage that or slow it down, but I don't think they're going to do the last two at all. And so the more that they push their supporters toward action. And the more that they say, well, that we should take back our country, they have to offer specific actions for them to do that are going to be different than what they've already offered. And what they've already offered, to be honest with you, are partly democratic means. Run for office, knock on doors, take over your school board, things like that. I don't think that is going to be enough now
Hmm.
with the martyrdom rhetoric. So you can see where that could go if not for the democratic means. That means we're moving into anti-democratic means. And this is why I suggest, of course, President Trump is going to respond in an authoritarian manner.
Yeah, yeah, I'm afraid that's the case too. Well, what would you most like people to take away from the book?
Um, I struggled with the last part, the afterward, like after you've read all this and you are, one person said, I scared them a lot. What is it you do? And you feel overwhelmed because it is a national mandate. It is a plan to take over the nation. So how's one person going to respond to that? And it has to be millions of one persons doing their responses. If democracy is a collection of people and not just a government philosophy, then everyone has to respond toward pro-democracy. It means talking to people, it means convincing people, it means persuading people, but it has to also mean that the compromise that we've been absent, has been absent for some time now.
Yes, absolutely. I know you're in the midst of a very important book launch, but I have to ask you, and maybe you've already alluded to this a little bit, what's on the radar screen for the future in terms of other books or other projects?
Uh, I have a couple ideas that were percolating before the assassination. And to be honest with you, I don't know what to do with those now. I don't know what the next few weeks or months would entail. But I did have something that doesn't have anything to do with Turning Point.
Hmm.
But I don't know what to do with those at the moment. And so they're just concepts in my mind at the moment.
Well, I think what you mentioned before, kind of a follow-up as to where Turning Point heads next, I think is going to have a lot of interest for folks.
Yeah, it's a continuing story indeed.
Wow. Well, Matthew, thanks so much for doing this work and joining us. I mean, as we talked about before, it's been magnified in importance because of what's happened, unfortunately, honestly. But thanks so much for digging out all of this information that is scary,
Mhm.
but people need to hear it, and we need to act on it. So again, the title of the book is The Seven Mountains Mandate: Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. Please go to wjkbooks.com and check it out. Matthew, good luck with the launch, and hopefully you'll be able to make a big difference.
Yeah, we'll see. Thanks for the interview.